So this talk, as already mentioned, is trust is the true measure of inclusion. So I have a quote on the screen, and it was not actually Nietzsche who said this, which is kind of telling. The quote is, "I'm not upset that you lied to me. I'm upset that from now on, I can't believe you." So on the screen, I have a picture of a small girl with her hand raised in the air, and that's me as a child. My name is Elle Waters, and I work at Adobe on the accessibility team. And I have on these slides, which I really hope you'll take me up on. I have my LinkedIn profile that you can connect with me and my email address, because I really want you to reach out directly so that we can keep talking. I am a white woman with dark hair with different colors of highlights, wearing a very comfy, nubby pink and orange sweater. And the land beneath this house that I live in and throughout the East Bay here in California is Huichin, the traditional unceded land of the Ohlone people. And I know that it's very popular to say these kinds of things, but truthfully, we wouldn't be in the inclusion business if we didn't think about everyone in this world in which we're fighting for digital equity in what we do. So our roadmap today, I'm going to provide a very brief and incomplete definition of trust and its importance. And we'll talk a little bit about additional considerations, and then how to establish and maintain that trust in accessibility on a daily basis. So, trust as a noun, the definition: a firm belief in the integrity, ability, or character of a person or thing, confidence or reliance. An alternative definition: the condition and resulting obligation of having confidence placed in someone or something. So when we look at that definition, we can see that trust is demonstrable. It is an action, it is a result, it's not just a feeling. Some words that come to mind when I queried a bunch of folks and friends about what trust means to them: honesty, expertise, accountability, reliability, transparency. And research shows that people trust honesty over perfection. So Power of Reviews in 2018 did some research on e-commerce and found that the probability of a person completing a purchase on an e-commerce site actually was between 4.2 out of 5 stars to 4.5 out of 5 stars, because, and this is important, a perfect 5-star rating is perceived by consumers as too good to be true. So when you present yourselves as infallible and flawless, there's a little bit of suspicion that naturally arises within a user, and that's important to consider. Trust is also relational. So we have relationships with other people, but we also have relationships with the bank that we use. I have a relationship with my grocer. I have a relationship with Adobe, who is my employer. And that's an important consideration. Harvard Business Review in 2019 did some research, and they took 3 key elements of what they considered to be factors of trust: relationships, judgment, and consistency. And in relationships, they were specifically looking at a manager with their employees. And they looked at, they defined relationships as staying in touch and demonstrating concern over others, cooperation, resolving conflict, and providing honest and helpful feedback. And they were really surprised that relationships matters more than judgment or consistency. So much so that if you had poor judgment and you were inconsistent, but you had strongly invested in relationships with the people on your team, that actually scored higher in trust than judgment and consistency combined. So from all of this, we can look at trust and recognize that it's complex, it's fragile, it's always changing, and it has a lot of factors that really affect our decision-making as human beings. So let's turn our focus to accessibility as a practice and start looking at that through that lens of trust. When I first started in the accessibility field, this is on the screen. I have an unrealistic, but not far from the mark picture of a library with stacks of books all around. And I did a tremendous amount of reading. And my first stop was, of course, looking at standards and requirements. So if I go to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, I see 223 general WCAG techniques, 108 common failures, 42 CSS techniques, 39 client-side scripting techniques, 5 server-side scripting techniques, 3 plain text techniques, 24 ARIA techniques, 23 PDF techniques. And for those of us who know and have gone through all of these different kinds of standards, that's not even the full list. So what do we call this in the accessibility field? A good start. Every single one of us started at some point in our journey in accessibility, and we felt a little overwhelmed, I'm sure. At least I definitely did. And yet all of this is important because it allows us to identify what those barriers are and help solve them. So there is an importance and a limitation to what we would consider bugs, accessibility bugs. The importance is that they are testable, that they are reproducible issues. There are things that we're able to look at and say, this is a functional operational limitation of a system preventing access for a person with disabilities. However, there is a limitation with bugs in that they really don't approach context. So how do we consider context within accessibility? So chapter 2 of my beginning in accessibility, after I was a bit overwhelmed by all the standards, but really wanted to understand how to be able to promote and contribute to this mission of inclusion and digital equity. So I started looking at all the various kinds of devices, assistive technologies, software, hardware, and different kinds of accommodation that people with disabilities might use. And the combinations of those obviously are going to differ according to each individual and how they choose to solve for whatever barriers they're encountering. And so within this, you could say that people who work in the accessibility field are considering context, because we pretty much bring context to almost any user experience that we're working with. If you're working on a team and they're talking about a modal dialogue, your approach at first usually is to talk to the person about the context of a person with disabilities. And then, of course, you know, as you get further along in your accessibility journey, you come across the scariest name for any software ever, which would be JAWS. On the screen, I have a big, great white shark. But with all of that said, what other factors might be affecting a person's experience beyond the assistive technology that they're using, beyond any kind of personal accommodations that they're using? So let's take a look at the news. Over the last year, the headlines, we have dealt with really polarizing protests, not only in the United States, but in Europe and lots of other countries that we're seeing. There have been droughts, there have been floods, deaths of monarchs. We have had record temperatures and swings from one side of the scale to the other. And in the news, we're being bombarded with things like, hey, meteors, hey, some really well-known scientists are considering that there might be alien technology at the bottom of the South Pacific. We have had COVID, monkeypox, bird flu. We've had people protesting by throwing soup onto Van Gogh paintings. We've had tourists falling into Mount Vesuvius after taking selfies. And we've recently encountered a ton of layoffs and other things. And in the moment of all of that, we might find some human resilience and stories that really bring us a laugh. There is on the screen, I have a picture of one in particular that was really meaningful to me. A grandmother went up to a Russian soldier and told him, put sunflower seeds in your pockets so they will grow on Ukrainian land after you die. And then We've seen babies with full-on face masks when they're traveling. And in all of this, we have to consider that this timeline that we are in is a lot for everyone. So we reduce a user's identity to only their disability if we fail to consider the full context in which they're interacting with our digital content. Let me restate this. We reduce a user's identity to only their disability if we fail to consider the full context in which they're interacting with our digital content. So let's look at contextual design and research. That has a long history, and a lot of it was really popularized by Karen Holtzblatt and Hugh Beyer. And they started looking at doing ethnographic research and looking at situational conditions, emotional and environmental conditions, different work models that people approach interacting with digital content. And that is something, an absolutely worthwhile and reasonable way to be able to approach how we get at a user's context. But there's no mechanism today for us to really adapt a UI based on these different kind of factors. So it's still something that ends up becoming an individual experience that we try and look at and create patterns for. We have at Adobe, we have a product equity team that was recently created. We're really excited about its future because one of their missions is to look at this and do contextual research and recognize that people are more than just one quality. People are more than just a person with disabilities. People are more than just a person of color. And when you start layering these different pieces together, you get a little closer to understanding the contextual needs of users. But today, here in accessibility, that is not something that we're able to really easily bring in. And why? Because we are in the gap business. We really do work, and you see a lot of fantastic work that people are looking at. Beyond compliance, we want to think about an inclusive design process. But if we are to look at that and prioritize that over the absolute desperate need today for better access, we do the disability community a disservice. And part of the respect that we show the disability community is acknowledging the wide chasm of inequity that exists today. On the screen, I have a picture of the flood that was Hurricane Katrina. I'm from Louisiana, and I have to share that during the time when there were incredible difficulties right after Katrina, there was a really active discussion in the United States about the levees and the architecture and the politics. And it was, quite frankly, offensive and infuriating to me because there were people who were stranded in their homes during the flood at that moment. And it's really important to recognize that while we strive for something that is deeper and more meaningful when we look at inclusion, we absolutely must resolve the obvious barriers that are excluding people today. So we have a challenge in the accessibility community, and yet it's a good challenge, which is to keep both of these things in mind, to think about what we might be designing for in the future, and also to recognize the practical, objective need to create more inclusion today. So how we handle these gaps, we're in the gap business, is how we can measure trust today. So let's look at what I'm positioning as your goal: to create a process that increases a user's trust in the overall accessibility of your digital content, both now and in the future. How you keep both of those concepts about working through the gaps, you are in the gap business, while also creating pathways to bring in some of those adaptive UIs that might consider the full context of human beings. Before we start with I said I was going to present, I think 4, maybe 8. I came up with 10, and then a bonus on top of that. I do want to start with one thing that really needs to happen as a foundation on which you would build all of the accessibility techniques and practices in your process. that I'm about to recommend, and that is to create an internal accessibility policy. That would include something like, which standards are you targeting? So at Adobe, it's the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, Level A, Level AA. And when 2.2 comes out, we will have a roadmap and we will get to that as well. So that's a part of what we would consider an internal accessibility policy. You also want to state some of those goals and what that process looks like. What are the requirements for your teams? And then here's an important last two pieces of that. You want to understand what those exceptions are. You don't want to have such a rigid internal accessibility policy that people feel like it's a target that they can't even hit. So consider the exceptions. Are there legacy UIs that you need to consider a different path for? Are there specific success criteria that you feel like will be more difficult for your organization to be able to meet? Therefore, maybe it has a different timeline than others. And then finally, most importantly, the ownership, both for accessibility, meeting those goals. At Adobe, the ownership for accessibility rests with our product teams. And that is an important piece to consider, but also the ownership over both the policy and its enforcement. Who is actually the person, the group, the particular process that is really reinforcing this policy, and who will be making updates to it in the future? So before we even start with the top 10 list, we want to make sure that you understand that having an internal accessibility policy is a really important feature. So number one, co-design with people with disabilities. I put this at the top of my top 10 list because this is the mission. Instead of looking at, we often look at compliance and standards as a piece of this, and that's something that we need to definitely consider. But people then say it's more than that, that WCAG is just a start. Like we said, it was a good start. And we think about testing with people with disabilities. And while that is important, that's still putting them in a position of reacting to what others have created. And if we're thinking about really changing the world by creating things in a more inclusive environment, then we're really talking about hiring people with disabilities so that they have not only an equal participation in the creation of digital content, but also a position of leadership so that they can lead. And on the screen, I have a 2021 study and data statistics from the Disability Compendium and the employment to population ratios. So people without disabilities, there's 76% of the population are employed. People with disabilities, 41%. That's egregious, and it's something that we should work to change. That is, I think, part and parcel to our mission. It's one of the reasons why I joined Adobe. I also have on the screen the Employer Assistance and Resource Network on disability inclusion. They have phenomenal assistance and guides on how to be able to hire people with disabilities, what you need to be considering when you're hiring people with disabilities. There's a co-design guide that the Western Australia government put out that I think is a fantastic thing that allows people to understand how to co-design with people with disabilities. But one thing, and I'm going to put a little tip at the end of each one of these, one thing to consider is that you really should establish some kind of procurement program in conjunction when you're looking to hire people with disabilities. So if none of the software that your company uses is accessible, that makes it a very difficult prospect to have somebody employed who then can't do their job effectively because the software isn't accessible. So you want to consider this, and there are ways to be able to co-design with people with disabilities where they're not on staff. But I think that that really is the primary mission of what you should think about with this particular top 10 list, the number one. Number two, conduct inclusive research and user testing. So I have on the screen two different organizations that Adobe has worked with. I have great confidence in both. Nobility has not only a fantastic consulting agency, but they also have a program called Access Works where they have an entire group of people with disabilities who participate in usability studies. And like them, Fable also has similar services. And when people think about user testing with people with disabilities or usability testing with people with disabilities, they often think that they have to have a fully complete product and that they want to be able to make sure that they've done everything that they can to ensure that it's fully accessible before they ask, say, a sighted keyboard user or a person who uses a screen reader to be able to do that usability testing. And while that is true when you're looking at a full live site, there are steps before that that you could take to incorporate and engage with people with disabilities before you get to that point in your product lifecycle. So on the screen, I have a few different areas that represent different steps in your process. Site architecture and task flows. This is a fantastic opportunity to bring in someone who might be neurodivergent or might have cognitive disabilities, and make sure that all of the semantics and the way that you're structuring your task flows are intuitive and make sense. You can look at low fidelity and high fidelity designs before you even put any kind of code behind it. And you can use that in usability testing with low vision users. You will get understanding about how easily discoverable things are with regards to proximity. Color contrast becomes a factor in this, and making sure that you've really made something that works well for low vision users. And then when you get to prototypes and live content, yes, it's absolutely a great opportunity to bring in anybody who is a primary keyboard user, whether sighted or a screen reader user, and have them work through some of your prototypes. So here's a tip. Disability is a usability amplifier. If you're already doing this work, then if you put people with disabilities into that same process to be able to work with you, you're going to find that they will be the first ones to encounter a usability issue. And so there's an opportunity there for you to position the disability community in your design workflow and in your prototyping so that they're able to provide really, really specific guidance for you. Number 3, and this is something that I really don't know how you could be in accessibility without having a real focus on testing. We almost always come back to this, but oftentimes bringing testing into your organization can feel overwhelming and daunting because, as we saw before, there's so many details, even within just the compliance point of view, looking at the web content accessibility guidelines, it can become pretty exhausting if you want to be able to have full comprehensive accessibility testing. And so my recommendation is to conduct smart accessibility testing. And that means if you're looking at things from a patterns perspective first, from your design system, for example, you want to be able to put a lot of attention on that. You want to be able to run it through automated testing, like we use the Axe solution for that, and then do comprehensive manual testing at that component level. Then if you're in, say, product or interaction design, for example, there are things that we call smoke tests, especially business advocates who are looking to promote and work with a product. This gives them a non-technical way to be able to support the overall inclusion of your work by having them run through keyboard accessibility testing, for example, checking color contrast. These are very easy tests for people to learn, and it would be at maybe broader than a component level, more of a task flow level, but still really worthwhile. Then designers should be doing targeted manual testing on things that they specifically are in charge of. Then you move into development, and that is a huge opportunity for you to integrate automated testing into the test automation that you're already doing. And they too should be doing targeted manual testing, specifically keyboard accessibility, looking at the focus path management of dynamic content that they're doing. And then finally, when you're at a site level, you have the opportunity to really leverage automated testing as sort of a regular scan. And this is typically where most of your formal audits would exist. So that would be more of a comprehensive manual testing. But in doing that, you're catching any kind of gaps and resolving those gaps earlier. And it's a much more digestible way to be able to work through that accessibility testing. So if you separate it by role and product lifecycle phase, however you have your DevOps process laid out, your product lifecycle, then that will allow you to achieve those things and not feel like it's an overwhelming process. Number 4, create and share your accessibility roadmap. I can't begin to underscore how useful this is for your customers, for your users, for your constituents. This shows if you have proactive measures to improve accessibility, so not just your bug list, include both research and remediation. Anything you're doing to improve accessibility should be on your roadmap. And a roadmap really is effective only when you're able to provide dates. Probably throughout any given week, I'm having conversations with customers on behalf of Adobe, and I'm sharing our roadmap 4 or 5 times a week for different products. And customers regularly are looking for, what are those dates? What are you planning to do by when? And I encourage you to think both quarterly, but also multi-year. Some things are going to take longer. So on the screen, I have an example of the kinds of things that when we're approaching remediation that we focus on. I have automated testing, keyboard, contrast, and anything that's really specific about research findings, because we want to be able to get that in as early as possible. Then maybe later afterwards, semantics and focus path management. Then maybe later afterwards, if you're doing remediation, reflow, or maybe when you will adopt WCAG 2.2 after it comes out. All of these things are sort of signposts for your users, your customers, to be able to understand, what are you planning on doing? What can I count on? And it's important when you're looking at remediation work, speaking to that, because a lot of us do focus on, again, removing those gaps that we have in our products and in our digital content. When you're looking at that, please break those into smaller pieces. It is overwhelming for teams to be able to look at remediation efforts if they're seeing it as this giant mountain that they have to scale. And instead start looking at it through these digestible smaller pieces so that they can get wins early. The other reason why we put things like keyboard and contrast at the beginning of our remediation is not only does it have some of the highest value for end users, but it's also the easiest thing for teams that are new to accessibility to embrace and be able to accomplish. And so you want them to have some of those early wins so they too can get excited about accessibility and what they're doing. Number 5, publish an external accessibility statement. Usually really good accessibility statements have about 4 features to them. They have a vision statement with accessibility attached to that. They speak to the standards that your organization is targeting. There may be an issue, a section of content that talks about the features, the plans, what things that someone can count on when they encounter your content. I would avoid really technical specifics. I would also avoid something that's not evergreen, like which browsers, for example, because we're not working in the browser wars timeline. But it is important to think about, at a high level, an average user that happens to have disabilities going to that statement page on your website. They should be able to know, should I expect forms to work well? Should I expect there to be a good deal of keyboard accessibility? Depending on the appetite of your organization, you can talk about what some of those challenges that you're still encountering and you're still working on are. Not all organizations are comfortable sharing that. And last, but most important, also provide some kind of feedback mechanism. That could be as simple as an email address, or it could be a form that they fill in so that you have someone on the other side of that actually reading that content and responding on their behalf. And so on the screen, this is one of my tips. I think it's a really good idea to leverage your organization's motto or vision statement. This helps you position accessibility as the solution or the manifestation of that vision statement. So on the screen, I have 4 examples And I find this a very powerful way to tie your accessibility statement and put that ownership on the part of the executive leadership, who has really usually been pretty instrumental in defining their vision statement or their motto. There's one: guidance when you need it most. That was Humana's. Targets is expect more. The Department of Labor in the United States is promote pathways to economic liberty for individuals and families working to achieve the American dream. Adobe's is changing the world through digital experiences. Every one of us should be able to see how accessibility is really the answer to what in the underscoring and the manifestation of these vision statements. And so it's an incredibly powerful way to position this is our mission, because it is a part of who we are already as an organization. Number 6, publish accessibility work in your release notes. So some of you may not have release notes for your products, but those who are creating software, it's a pretty common thing to have each version, each release, you provide some release notes. As a video game enthusiast, I depend on that because I like understanding what features have happened and been introduced in the newest patch. On the screen, I have an example of Adobe Connect's release notes. And here are some features of this that I think are helpful. It's called out when it's an accessibility feature or a fix. I have an example list of several different accessibility fixes that were recently introduced with Adobe Connect. Fixed an accessibility issue in user status and device speaker menu. More specifically, fixed an accessibility issue where the chat pod default text did not have keyboard access. Fixed an accessibility issue using incorrect ARIA attributes in the attendee pod. This is really helpful for users to understand not only that you are actively working to address those gaps, but what was the problem? And so sometimes you're able to both provide the barrier and the fix. And it's also helpful if you have a bug ID or story ID for reference, because that way you empower your users. If they're still encountering some issues, say with keyboard access in the chat pod, they can reference the actual ID of that, and we're able to really reopen that ticket, look at it, and it's just a really great communication between user and organization. And again, provide a feedback mechanism so that people can contribute that information and help make your work better. Here's a tip: work with your engineers to gather this information. Everything that usually is in the tip area of my slides is really about promoting a shared ownership. It's not that you couldn't find these issues and be able to publish those release notes yourself or whoever does those content updates, but it's really helpful to work with your engineers in this so that they understand their work matters and it has meaning for the end user. It's not a bug in a technical sense. It's a bug in the human access sense. Number 7, provide accessibility help documentation. So on the screen, I have a snapshot of the Adobe Experience Platform accessibility help documentation. This is really useful because not everything that you create as an accessible solution may be incredibly intuitive or standardized. So drag and drop, I'm looking at you. This is a situation where a user may need more assistance in understanding how you have developed your UI. And if there's anything that's atypical or not super intuitive, or if there's, say, a really comprehensive list of keyboard shortcuts, sometimes you can put that within your application, and that's great. But sometimes you may want to provide more detailed information, and this is a place where you're able to do that. And so it shows that you've been very thoughtful about trying to approach how you will design maybe a custom experience to make it more accessible. Again, it also allows for a dialogue between you and your users. They understand your point of view and what you've tried to create, and then they can provide feedback if that's not sufficient and not enough. And again, engage with your team to produce this content. It promotes a sense of shared ownership. We have some amazing product managers and accessibility champions at Adobe. And one of the reasons why is because we really, really promote that sense of shared ownership. Number 8, publish your accessibility conformance reports, otherwise known as ACRs, sometimes called VPATs, voluntary product accessibility templates. On the screen, I have a page from Microsoft, from Apple, and from Adobe. I absolutely appreciate when companies do this, because to me, that demonstrates honesty. It's not like people couldn't go and find these barriers. We know that a lot of this stuff is right there. If you encounter a product that doesn't have keyboard accessibility, you don't need an ACR to tell you that. You can experience it. But it's really helpful to demonstrate that you are regularly auditing your products and your digital content. And especially if you adopt sort of a predictable cadence for these accessibility conformance reports, then people understand that, say, from an Adobe perspective, we aim to have our audits, our external audits, done once a year. This really helps reinforce not only the commitment, but can show progress over time for those who are looking to see exactly how committed your organization is to accessibility. Second to last one, number 9, provide accessibility training. So on the screen, I have a screenshot that demonstrates our Blue Lines design documentation for accessibility notes with accessible names, landmark regions, headings, keyboard tab, order, and focus. And this is just one example of how to provide that kind of training. And I would recommend that you start small. Think about specific topics that you're getting questions about a lot that might be easy to either create an internal article for your team, or maybe a short video, and just build your library of materials. And another good idea is to consider providing a learning track for users. So once someone has finished one kind of training, what should they be looking to learn next? And everyone is learning in this field, so don't be afraid to share your insights. I think I was probably conducting training within the first year that I got into accessibility, and that was terrifying. At the same time, I was a little further along the path than the people I was training, so therefore I had the opportunity to be able to share what I had learned up until that point, which is really helpful. And last but not least, number 10, contribute back to the community. Participate in standards groups. If you have created a solution for something, publish it. And if it's something that you write a blog post, that's great. If it's something that you have a code example, then publish that as open source for people to be able to use. Participate in conferences. We all learn from one another. And I can't tell you how many times that I have leaned on Scott O'Hara, Adrian Roselli, Glenda Sims. All of these people have contributed back to the community, and we're all greater for it. And so if you contribute back to the community, the best way to learn something is to teach it. And if you contribute back to the community, you too will learn from the feedback that people provide. Here's a tip. Co-present with your customers or team members in your organization. Again, the best way to learn something is to teach it and to promote that sense of shared ownership. I have had the most exciting times, even the last couple of AXCON presentations I've given have been co-presenting with people, because it's an opportunity to support someone else in their journey and really reinforce that we are all part of the same community. And so we want to be able to encourage people who are new to have that support when they're presenting publicly about accessibility. So accept that this is all going to be a work in progress. Here are some complex problems that Adobe is still working on. We have the basics for data visualization, but there's a lot more and deeper and more advanced kinds of problems that we're trying to solve with data visualization. We're also looking, as you know, Adobe has quite a number of design tools, and we're looking how to better support people with low vision and blindness, because traditionally those creative tools have been exclusive of people with disabilities. And we want to be able to encourage people with visual impairment should absolutely be able to use creative design tools. We're looking at the complex challenge about large-scale remediation efforts around reflow. And internally at Adobe, so that everyone understands what we're talking about, reflow is kind of a hard word for people to necessarily grab hold of. We just call it 400% Zoom. And that is something that we're working very hard to be able to solve for, but it's not a simple problem to solve. And then last, but certainly not least, generative AI. There's lots of open questions about accessibility and making sure that people are not left behind, once again, when a new technology surfaces. So your homework today, I encourage you to review your accessibility practice at your organization and think about incorporating some or all of these activities in your work. They all demonstrate something that we talked about earlier about whether it be honesty or expertise or accountability or reliability or transparency. They all demonstrate this for your users. And then consider the full context of your users and look for opportunities to bring that into the work that you do, whether it be through inclusive design research, whether it be in understanding how to create more adaptive UIs. You can start working on that because that will be something that we're moving towards very, very quickly. And then finally, share your struggles and your wins with others. So I will leave you with this. Inclusion is political. There is no escaping the fact that inclusion is political. Mike Monteiro, a good friend, designer, and author, wrote the necessary second edition to Design as a Job. And he states, when you decide who you're designing for, you're making an implicit statement about who you're not designing for. And a little closer to home, one of my favorite speakers, Imani Barbaran, I usually end almost every presentation that I give with this quote because it's so meaningful. Accessibility is not just a set of physical things that are put into place, but a living language that speaks to who society decides to value based on who they allow into the public sphere. Should access not be granted, you have spoken to that value system. So thank you so much for your time today. If you have questions on the screen, I have French's mustard ice cream because I have questions about that. Would love to talk with you. And again, let's keep this conversation going. So you can check out where I work. You can connect with me on LinkedIn and you can reach out to me directly. Thanks.
Thank you, Elle. Really appreciate what you've done and the conversation you had. So just a note real quick, Elle, as we started that conversation, there was a couple technical difficulties. I will let know anybody who missed that beginning of Elle's comments. We will have this posted. We recorded it. So we will report, we will go have that recording available for everybody that they can watch those beginning comments that we had. Thanks. Since we had those technical difficulties. By the way, I will admit also too in the chat where Elle will get a copy of this. Steve says, Elle, you remain my hero as a blind guy who's had to live life been in the field. I keep getting everybody telling me how great a presentation in a field who just wants to live life. Everyone, these points resonate deeply with me, especially your honesty and transparency. It is a joy when those things come through. So one of the participants just thanking you for your comments, Elle. I wanted to make sure we called that out as well.
That wouldn't be Steve Sawson, would it? I haven't looked at the.
I don't know. So, so there is a couple questions that we have in our Q&A. There's one of them that's really important, and you've mentioned this a couple times in your top 10 list about including people with disabilities, either as employees, as co-designers, conducting. So how do you foster that trust among disabled employees or participants so they know they fit in, right? Accessibility is essential, but sometimes it feels hollow when disabled employees come in because it hasn't been a focus for a company or they haven't had that chance before. So how do you build that trust that their words, their actions are going to count within a company?
There are a couple of things that come to mind. I think that I should acknowledge that this is not an easy challenge, and we're absolutely asking something harder for someone with disabilities to have to deal with an unfinished product or something that there will be absolutely barriers in their way. And so I want to acknowledge that it's unfair that we should ask that of people, but it's likely unavoidable if we want to, quote, be the change that we want to see. There's a certain amount of partnership that we need with people with disabilities to make that happen. So it's an uncomfortable and like I said, unfair position to put them in. I don't know that there's an easier way to be able to, it's rare that you would find a company that has no employee. Well, first of all, there is no company that has no employee with disabilities, but where you don't have an active disability community at an organization, and yet they've done everything to make it fully inclusive, and then they bring someone in. You're always going to be going in with the understanding that it's an imperfect scenario. In doing that, I think that there are a couple of signals that I would encourage people with disabilities and anybody who wants to work at a company that really values inclusion. There are indicators about whether or not it matters to them. The first thing I would say is you need that level of executive sponsorship. So if you're not finding the voice of executives really opening those doors for you in the beginning by stating their commitment and the commitment of the organization, then I think that it's a challenge to be able to try and push that uphill and be able to get that organization really creating a safer environment psychologically and a more inclusive environment. I think that when I mentioned procurement, I think that that is something that really should be probably emphasized, that when you're hiring somebody with disabilities, if you're expecting them to just be okay with no keyboard access and no captioning on video calls, which we all do these days, all of those things to me would be flags that I would say you have to have some of this work done in advance. So that demonstration is a respect for employees with disabilities and also just a practical reality. So those are the two things I think of. The third is probably having an employee group that is dedicated to people with disabilities. So at Adobe, we have Access at Adobe. A lot of tech organizations, a lot of nonprofit organizations have employee groups specifically to promote the needs and inclusion of people with disabilities at that place. Those are the things that first come to mind for that.
I know we have other questions in the chat. We won't have necessarily time to get to those, but one thing I will promise to do is pass those questions on to Elle, so
Great.
Elle can start that conversation and answer those questions back, because her and I talked a lot before the session. And one thing I want to underscore to the team, one, Elle is very serious when she says she wants to be part of that dialogue.
Very much.
Two, Elle and I were both commenting, and Elle being part of this group, I'm going to underscore this, is the accessibility community is a giving community. And Elle is one of those individuals that, you know, hey, Elle, if you, how do you put up with this? Or how did you do this? Or where did you start? As seen in Elle's other talks she's given at XCon, she's always willing to share, you know, her trials and tribulations, but her successes as well, right? Because I know, Elle, you're very, very passionate about, you don't want some people to have to go through maybe some of the struggles you had to do, or maybe, you know, been there, done that, wouldn't do that again, I would do this instead. Yeah. Sharing that information, that experience Absolutely. With somebody is something important. Before we go ahead and log off today, Elle, I wanted to give you the last word of that last thing you wanted to make sure we remembered from your presentation. So is there something that you want to make sure that we take away from your talk that we hold dear as we go throughout AXCON?
Thank you. Yeah, I think that it's really about the idea that we're in that position of having to approach this as a very pragmatic and important need to remove those barriers, and yet to always view people with disabilities through that lens of the whole person. And so we want to recognize that all of us have had a pretty hellish last 3 years, and that this is one facet that's a practical, urgent need to remove barriers to create greater access, but to really be considerate of the entire person in that. Last thing I'll say too is my email address is ewaters adobe.com. I am absolutely serious about finishing any kind of thoughts you have if you want to share with me or have those conversations.
Great, Elle. Appreciate it. I want to thank Elle so much again for her presentation and her talk. Want to thank all the participants, the chat. Again, Elle will get a copy of that too, but thank you for your participation in the chat and taking some of Elle's ideas and just continuing to adding to those. The Elle and the participants is what always gives me goosebumps about these presentations, because you see so much great ideas come forward. And I'm going to encourage everyone, enjoy the rest of AXCON, those presentations. We got a lot of other good presenters coming up.
Thanks to our ASL interpreter too.
Yeah, exactly. Elle set that bar high for your other presenters, but I'm sure they'll be able to hit that bar. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your day at AXCON.
Thanks, everyone.